Hello, this is Dr. James Camp from Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is the endocrine system, Part A, the pituitary gland. Before we can talk about the pituitary gland, you need to know that in the various illustrations in this presentation, it may go by some different names. That's because the pituitary gland has a few nicknames. The pituitary gland is also known as the hypophysis, since it is hypo or under the brain. There are, as you recall, two major lobes to the pituitary. The anterior lobe, or anterior pituitary, is a true gland. This gland makes and secretes or releases its own hormones, while the posterior pituitary is sometimes thought of as a false gland. The hormones secreted or released by this gland are made elsewhere. They're made by neurons of the hypothalamus and then trucked down their axons to their release site in the posterior pituitary. For that reason, the anterior pituitary is also known as the adenohypophysis, because adeno is the Greek root word used for gland. And the posterior pituitary is also known as the neurohypophysis, because neuro means nervous tissue, and the hypophysis is largely made of axons, nervous tissue from the hypothalamus. Finally, there are a couple of other nicknames. The anterior pituitary is the most distal part of the pituitary gland, so it's called the pars distalis, the distal part. And the posterior pituitary, again, is made of nervous tissue, so it's called the pars nervosa, or nervous part. Okay. We're going to talk about the master glands first, the hypothalamus and its interaction with the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus is the main link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Because, being part of the brain, it is naturally part of the nervous system and linked into all of the pieces of the nervous system. But it's also intimately connected to the anterior and posterior pituitaries, and so it is part of the endocrine system. Also, the hypothalamus produces several hormones, so it is, in that sense, an endocrine gland in its own right. The hypothalamus is the main regulator of the anterior pituitary, called the master gland of the endocrine system, because most of the anterior pituitary hormones serve to control the activity of other endocrine glands. And finally, of interest here, we have a portal vein system that carries blood from one organ, the hypothalamus via the infundibulum here, to another organ, the anterior pituitary. This is one of, normally veins carry blood from an organ back to the heart. This is one of two places in the body where veins carry blood from one organ into another. How it works. The hypothalamus produces releasing hormones. So we can put a little RH here from the hypothalamus. And those releasing hormones get into the primary plexus, the capillary bed of the hypophyseal portal vein system. And these little hormones travel through the hypophyseal portal veins until they get to the pars distalis, until they get to the capillary bed of the anterior pituitary. And from there, these releasing hormones spread out into the tissue of the pars distalis. From there, they trigger the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary, most of which are what we refer to as tropic hormones, hormones that have the effect of causing a hormone to be released somewhere else in the body. So we can put a tropic hormone here, is produced here in the anterior pituitary as a result of this releasing hormone, and so that tropic hormone makes it into the blood here and travels through these capillaries and out to the systemic circulation, where they then go to the heart, and from the heart to just about everywhere else. Once they spread around the body, those tropic hormones will now stimulate other glands to release their hormones, and that is what makes this a master gland. You could say in a way that the anterior pituitary releasing TSH is being a master gland, and the thyroid gland is being its servant by releasing thyroid hormone in response. But keep in mind that the anterior pituitary doesn't do anything on its own. It only releases hormones when the hypothalamus tells it to. So the hypothalamus is the master of the master. We also have what we might call an unmaster gland, the posterior pituitary. Once again, the hypothalamus is the main link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. But in this case, we're not regulating master control systems. We're simply linking the endocrine system to behaviors that to situations that the hypothalamus monitors as part of its role in the nervous system. So the hypothalamus plays a key role in monitoring body hydration in its role as the body's thirst center. So let's say we had a thirst center right here. That would be ideal to be in charge of the hormone ADH, antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin, which, as you know, is, as you know from our study of the urinary system, is involved in retaining water in the body when the body becomes dehydrated. The hypothalamus is also involved through its connections to the nervous system in activities regarding childbirth and lactation, both of which use the hormone oxytocin. So let's say that this nucleus here of the hypothalamus is most involved in or connected to the uterus and the mammary glands. It would be an excellent place to produce and control the release of oxytocin. Why not just release those hormones right there? Well, there are a number of reasons. The one that comes to mind most obviously is that the hypothalamus is a part of the brain, which means it is separated from the rest of the body by the blood-brain barrier. We could dump all of our hormones in the hypothalamus, but the blood can't get to them. So instead, we take these hormones and we truck them down these little axons here and then release them into the posterior pituitary. Where there is a nice healthy blood supply that can pick up those hormones and carry them throughout the body. So in this sense, the posterior pituitary becomes simply a convenient spot for the hypothalamus to release its hormones into the bloodstream, rather than being a true gland of its own. Here's how it works. Two nuclei of the hypothalamus contain neurons whose cell bodies make hormones, ADH and oxytocin. The axons of these hypothalamic neurons extend down through the infundibulum into the posterior pituitary, where they release their hormones. These two hormones are therefore released and secreted by the posterior pituitary, the neurohypophysis, but they are actually made in the hypothalamus. That raises the excellent question, what do we call them? Hormones that come from the anterior pituitary are obviously anterior pituitary hormones. They're made there, they're released there. Hormones that come from the thyroid gland are obviously thyroid hormones. Hormones that come from the pancreas are pancreatic hormones. What do we call hormones that come from the hypothalamus through the posterior pituitary? We could call them hypothalamic hormones because they're made there and the hypothalamus controls their release. But this doesn't work so well because we have other hypothalamic hormones, the releasing hormones, that are made in the hypothalamus but released more like normal hormones, just released into the blood to be carried by the hypophyseal portal system. So how do we distinguish between these hormones and those hormones? We could call them posterior pituitary hormones. That would be unambiguous. They're hormones that come out of the posterior pituitary. And many people do call them that. But that's a little dishonest. It doesn't remind us that it's the hypothalamus that makes the hormones and the hypothalamus that controls when those hormones are released. So, unfortunately, we kind of have to call these hypothalamic/posterior pituitary hormones. They come out in the posterior pituitary, but they're made in the hypothalamus and controlled in the hypothalamus. When you look at the pituitary gland under a microscope, what you'll notice is that over in one side, you have a jumble of cells, which are basically your standard cuboidal epithelial cells, except instead of being arranged in nice cuboidal, nice single layers of cuboidal cells like you usually see them, these cuboidal cells are just jumbled together. It's the first example we'll see of a sort of a tissue organization that I call the endocrine jumble. These endocrine tissues look almost like they've just been kind of thrown together. That's because there's really no need for organization in these cells. All you need to do is have a few cells close enough to a blood capillary that the hormones they secrete can get into the blood. So you don't really need elaborate organization. And with the exception of the thyroid gland and the adrenal cortex, we're going to see that very few glandular tissues in the endocrine system exhibit much organization at all. When you turn your attention to the posterior pituitary, what you'll see is a whole bunch of little kind of lavender swirls of nervous tissue here. And these are essentially the axons from those neurons that make the hormones in the hypothalamus. So this is your anterior pituitary over here. This is your posterior pituitary over here. We're going to talk about the anterior hormones first. The anterior pituitary hormones include all of the tropic hormones that we talked about in our previous lecture on the master gland system. And by and large, the function of those tissues is to stimulate secretion of what we were calling signal hormones, hormones that actually carry signals throughout the body to various places, various target organs. Prolactin is one of the few anterior pituitary hormones that's not a tropic hormone. It does not stimulate another hormone. Instead, it stimulates production of milk, in other words, lactation. And melanocyte stimulating hormone is an odd hormone that is not fully understood in humans. Its name comes from its function in stimulating production of melanin in the skin. However, the melanin in the skin, the melanocytes in the skin, can make their own MSH to stimulate their own darkening, and it's unclear how much exactly melanocyte stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland has to do with our skin darkening. However, it has been shown that injections of melanocyte stimulating hormone can cause a person to become darker, to become tanned. Melanocyte stimulating hormone does have a couple of other functions, however. It suppresses appetite. And it regulates or promotes sexual arousal. How it is that one hormone is involved in making your skin darker, making you feel less hungry, and making you feel turned on all at the same time, I'm not sure, but I guess nature likes to recycle and reuse. Okay, now we're going to go through each of these hormones. This is the hormone by hormone part of this presentation, and we're going to talk about how you fill out those hormone cards for each hormone made by the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary. Here's an example. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, also known as thyrotropin, is made by the anterior pituitary. The stimulus for its release is thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH, which comes from the hypothalamus. The target of thyroid stimulating hormone is going to be the thyroid gland, and it stimulates thyroid hormone T3 and T4 secretion. Its pattern is a cascade. Obviously, we've got a hormone being stimulated by one hormone and stimulating in turn another hormone, so that's going to have to be one of those multi-hormone cascade patterns. This cascade pattern is unique because it's got a very interesting negative feedback, where as thyroid hormone builds up in the body, thyroid stimulating hormone secretion decreases. Okay, the anterior pituitary also secretes adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, or corticotropin. The stimulus for this is CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, which again comes from the hypothalamus. Its target, as the name implies, adrenocorticotropic hormone, is the adrenal cortex. Its main effect is to stimulate secretion of the hormone cortisol, which, as we know, supports glucose production in humans. Secretes mobilization of resources, I should say, to produce more glucose under times of stress. It also has a minor effect in causing the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone, causing your blood pressure to go up in times of stress. And the pattern here is, once again, we have a hormone stimulated by a hormone that stimulates more hormones, so it's one of those multi-hormone cascades. Growth hormone, we've got another cascade pattern going on here. Growth hormone is stimulated by growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Now here we start to get into some interesting target patterns. Um, one direct target of growth hormone is bones and cartilages. And for those hormones, its effect is to directly stimulate growth in size. Another target is skeletal muscles. And its purpose there is, its effect there is to stimulate an increase in muscle mass. And in fact, growth hormone is sort of a drug of abuse among some bodybuilders. And then finally, its work as a tropic hormone is that it stimulates the liver to act as a endocrine gland for a moment and produce insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs. And it's important to note here that what's insulin-like about the hormone is its overall shape and structure, not what it does. It has nothing to do with blood sugar. It is a growth factor. It causes growth and repair responses in various tissues all over the body. In fact, growth hormone continues to be made in small amounts in adult humans who are no longer growing. It's been observed, humans have been observed to release small amounts of growth hormone during their sleep periods, which is thought to cause the liver to produce enough IGFs to stimulate tissue repair responses during your sleep. FSH, once again, a cascade pattern here. The stimulus for this is gonadotropin releasing hormone, because it is one of the two gonadotropin hormones. Its target is the ovaries in females, the testes in males. In the ovaries, it has the effect of stimulating ovarian follicle development, as the name follicle stimulating hormone might suggest. And as part of that, it has the tropic hormone effect of stimulating estrogen, stimulating the release of the production and release of the hormone estrogen. In the testes, FSH does not have as much of a complicated pattern. It simply stimulates sperm production. In the ovaries, the stimulation of estrogen actually has a positive feedback effect on follicle stimulating hormone, which then has a positive feedback on producing more estrogen, leading to a positive feedback loop in which FSH builds and estrogen builds until the conditions for ovulation have been met. Luteinizing hormone is the other gonadotropin, and so it is also stimulated by gonadotropin releasing hormone. Its targets are the same, the ovaries in females and the testes in males. In the ovaries, it causes luteum. In the ovaries, it causes ovulation and luteum development, which is where it gets the name luteinizing hormone. As part of that, it also stimulates the release of progesterone, the other female sex hormone. In the testes, luteinizing hormone, once again, is much simpler. It simply stimulates secretion of testosterone. Prolactin is a little bit more curious. It's once again a cascade pattern, but it's not exactly clear what the stimulus is. Many of your textbooks will tell you that there is a prolactin releasing hormone, PRH, but that hormone has actually never been found. It is hypothesized to exist, but we don't know. We do know that there's a prolactin inhibiting hormone, more commonly known as the neurotransmitter dopamine. So we have to have a decrease in dopamine being sent from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary in order for prolactin to be released. But we also know that not every person who's low on dopamine starts lactating. So there's thought to be some sort of prolactin releasing hormone in there. We just don't know what it is right now. So we're just going to have to leave that with a question mark right now. The target for prolactin is the mammary gland. And its effect at the mammary gland is to promote lactation, production of milk. Production, but not release of milk, as we'll see when we get to oxytocin. Finally, MSH. I've been unable to find any resources that tell me what the stimulus for melanocyte-stimulating hormone is, but we do know that it has targets in the skin where it causes melanocytes to increase the production of melanin, and that it has targets in the brain itself where it suppresses hunger at some times and produces sexual arousal at others. In fact, injections of a melanocyte-stimulating hormone analog that was intended to be a sort of a tanning agent ended up producing erections and arousal responses in all of the male patients that they tried it in. All right. We now have, wrapping this up, we have two posterior pituitary hormones. Antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, has been met already, as we mentioned in the chapter on the urinary system. Its function is to reabsorb water in response to dehydration. Oxytocin, on the other hand, is a little more complicated. It has several functions, most of which have to do with positive feedback related to reproduction. So the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, also known as vasopressin, is stimulated directly by low blood osmotic pressure. As measured by the hypothalamus itself. The target for this hormone, the low blood osmotic pressure, being a measure of dehydration. The target of this hormone is the collecting ducts of the kidneys, where it has the effect of reabsorbing H2O from the urine, thereby decreasing the body's dehydration slightly. The pattern in this case makes it a very simple negative feedback loop. Oxytocin is a bit more complicated. Its stimulus depends a bit on which pattern you're looking at. So in its childbirth mode, its stimulus is stretch receptors in the is direct stimulation of the hypothalamus by stretch receptors in the cervix and vagina, which makes it go to its target, the uterine muscles, where it promotes an increase in contractions. Which is a simple positive feedback loop. In its role in lactation or breastfeeding, is stimulated by a number of nervous system stimuli, most commonly suckling of the baby on the mother's teat. But it can also be stimulated by something as simple as hearing a baby cry for food. Here it goes to the target, the mammary gland, and causes what we call milk ejection, or colloquially letdown. And again, that's a positive feedback loop. And then finally, we know that oxytocin has targets in the brain of both males and females, and that its effect there is that it's involved in pair bonding, especially of reproductive pairs, but also in social bonding as well, in-group, out-group bonding, and bonding with members of one's family, members of one's social group, members of whatever groups one belongs to. Oxytocin is thought to have lots of other effects as well, since men make oxytocin. Clearly, there must be some reason for it to have an effect when men don't have mammary glands or uterine muscles. But exactly what role oxytocin has in male reproduction is still unclear.